This is the Lady Franklin Museum, Ancanthe, at Lena Valley in Tasmania. It's always seemed really odd to me that a Greek-style temple should have been built in Tasmania. To understand why, I need to investigate Lady Jane Franklin and her husband Sir John Franklin. I also want to look at some of the art of the colonial period, and I want to examine the work of artist Haughton Forrest, who worked with Mr. Beattie. And then I want to see how the museum building is used today. G'day, I'm John Stevenson. Welcome to Forgotten Tasmania. I've packed a lot into this episode, so let's get started. John Franklin was born into the landed gentry in Lincolnshire in 1786. John's father bought him a position in the Royal Navy, where he worked his way up the ranks, and in 1823 he married his first wife, Eleanor Ann Porden, a poet. Their daughter Eleanor Isabella was born, but then his wife died of tuberculosis in 1825. John was part of Lord Nelson's squadron, and he fought in battles before joining Captain Matthew Flinders aboard the Investigator and coming to Australia. I get the impression that John Franklin was quite gung-ho. During his 1819 expedition from the Hudson Bay to the Coppermine River in Canada, they ran out of food and he tried to eat his own leather boots. He lost 11 of 20 men, mostly to starvation. But there was also a murder and accusations of cannibalism. I get the impression he was used to ordering men into fierce battles, and he didn't seem to fear danger. Jane Franklin was no commoner. Her father was John Griffin, governor of the Goldsmiths Company. That's a very wealthy guild that started around 1327. Jane's mother was Jane Gillimard. There was Huguenot, that's Protestant, ancestry on both sides of her family. With the Revolutionary Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1789, Protestants gained equal rights as citizens. Jane was born just 2 years later in 1791 in London, where she was raised with her sisters Frances and Mary. She was well educated, her father being well-to-do, and he had her education completed by lots of travel on the continent. In 1828 she married John Franklin. The following year, 1829, he was knighted, and in 1837 he was appointed as the 5th governor of Van Diemen's Land, replacing the infamous Governor George Arthur. The Franklins were reformers. Lady Jane Franklin, with the support of her husband, was intent on improving the quality of life in the colony and establishing education and the arts. The strangest surviving legacy of the Franklins is a folly, a Greek-style temple situated in Lena Valley. It was built in 1842 to Lady Jane's specifications, based on the Parthenon that she'd seen in her travels. She called it Ancanthe, which means blooming, or possibly thistle, depending on your interpretation of the Latin. Lena is the Aboriginal word for kangaroo, and Lena Valley was originally called Kangaroo Bottom, and then Kangaroo Valley. Lady Jane left the surrounding 400 acres of land in trust, with the hope that it would become a focus for culture and the arts in the colony. It originally housed artworks and treasures that the Franklins had donated. Some members of the civil service didn't appreciate her views, especially her more humanitarian approach. Business, at least in the south of the island, seemed to be built on cheap convict labour. Sir John was removed from office, but his 6-year term was nearly up anyway. His humanitarian approach wasn't appreciated by the British government, and the consensus of opinion now is that he was just ahead of his time, and his wife more so. It seems the Franklins did much to improve Tasmania, and are remembered fondly, although the museum was disbanded and the building was used as an Apple store until 1936, when the property was transferred to the Hobart City Council. In 1848 it was leased to the Art Society, which had formed in 1884, and in 1949 the Society had an official reopening ceremony for the museum building, a film of which you can see on YouTube thanks to Libraries Tasmania. The Art Society has occupied the building ever since. The Franklins were Tasmania's first power couple. After his term as governor, he disappeared looking for a northwest passage. He was trying to find a route from England to America and then on to Asia, starting in the Arctic Ocean and then going through to the Pacific Ocean via Canadian waters. In those days, people actually believed that seawater couldn't freeze. He sailed off through Arctic ice with virtually no protection from the cold, which reminds me of the Titanic. Curiously enough, our old mate Norwegian Roald Amundsen was the first to traverse the Northwest Passage 58 years later. Franklin is generally credited with the discovery of the route, even though he never returned to claim victory. Lady Jane sponsored 7 expeditions to find out what happened to her husband. One, in 1859, found evidence Sir John had perished in 1847. Lady Jane continued the search for answers until her death in 1875. There was a TV series made about Sir John Franklin's final voyage called The Terror, which was the name of one of the ships, the other ship being the Erebus. The wrecks of these ships were discovered in 2014 and 2016. I suspect that inspired the 2018 TV series. Defining what is art is really hard. A University of British Columbia article was pointed out to me as something that might have had a really good try at it. That article said art is anything made deliberately by humans with the intention of being artistic, which shows you how circular the argument is and possibly how pointless. They did say any brief definition of art would oversimplify the matter. I'm always reminded of a particular phrase from something called the Hickland test. It was established by the Regina versus Hickland court case in England in 1868, and the practical outcome of which is the phrase, "I know it when I see it." And don't get me started on the whole is photography art question. Although by the standards I just set, I think it's pretty clear to me that it is. Art in Tasmania started tens of thousands of years ago with the first Tasmanians. There are rock carvings to prove it, although the Aboriginals would have had other forms of art, possibly bark paintings, but those didn't survive as long as etched stone. The first non-Indigenous art may have been the maps made by Abel Tasman in 1642, or maybe John Webber's sketch of a possum in 1777. Again, it's hard to say. For me, art of the Tasmanian colonial period is a tad easier to define. It started out being all very proper. For all the terrible things going on in that period, I haven't seen any truly angry paintings. Maybe it was the Victorian influence, or maybe the painters just wanted everything to look nice. The earliest paintings show very English scenery. Actual Tasmanian bush and trees have been reinterpreted as English oaks and that sort of thing. But quickly the paintings become more realistic. Benjamin Dutero's pictures misrepresented the real appearance and personality of his studies, according to David Taylor in his thesis. Thomas Bock was allegedly more accurate. He's interesting as he became an early photographer using the daguerreotype process. Thomas Bock made that lovely portrait of Lady Jane Franklin, circa 1838. Bock's portraits of the Tasmanian Aborigines show them as proud and noble people, portraying their character as well as their likeness in their native costume, or dressed in Western attire having been forcibly assimilated. The proclamation to the Aboriginal people by Governor Arthur, called the Franklin Boards, was a visual form of communication. Franklin recognised that Aboriginal people communicated or recorded things visually, and he tried to tap into that. With today's eyes, we can clearly see the sadness. But for those times, these pictures, the art of the day, it clearly lied. They're a contrived representation, as one person said in a video I watched on the National Library of Australia website. A lot of people put a lot of store in the works of John Glover, and if it wasn't for Richard Flanagan's terrible book, I'd have mentioned Gould. There are, of course, dozens of other artists worthy of mention, but I'm not going to mention them. In the later part of the colonial period, art created in Tasmania expands to more joyous subjects. Artists are painting for pleasure, with freer expression, rather than merely documenting this land for those back in the old country. By 1882, the world was ready for more images of Tasmania. Beattie's images of the landscapes, especially the rugged southwest, helped kickstart a fledgling tourism industry. His timing, both with the technology of photography and the desire for all things Tasmanian, led to his success. In 1883, a young art student named Louisa Swan, with her friend Maria Evans, joined forces in a small studio over a shop in Liverpool Street, and in 1884 the Art Association was formed, later renamed the Art Society of Tasmania. The objective was to encourage art, especially by holding exhibitions of paintings, drawings, wood carvings and other works. The Art Society's annual exhibitions attracted many artists of note from the mainland and were followed by a ball. Both events became highlights of Hobart's social scene. Until 1849, when they moved into Ancanthe, the Society was without a permanent home. In its early years, exhibitions were held in places such as Fitzgerald's Store, the Masonic Hall, the Town Hall, and an office in the public buildings in Macquarie Street. The Art Society had an impressive early membership, including artist Horton Forrest. He worked with John Watt Beattie, both painting scenes from the past that couldn't be photographed, and also making paintings of scenes photographed by Beattie, who in return also photographed Forrest's paintings. They were responsible for the first publication of a centrefold containing a 2-page photo dated 1889. It depicted Hobart and Mount Wellington from the harbour. Forrest painted Hobart from mid-harbour, ensuring that every building was included. So when Beattie took his photo of Hobart from the harbour, everyone was amazed to see that he'd overcome a well-known limitation of photography. Beattie and Forrest set out to bring the wilderness of Tasmania to the world via photographs painted in colour on artist board or canvas. As a result, a single Beattie photo of the west coast has appeared repainted over and over again. About 2,000 are still hanging on family walls around Tasmania. The Forrest Project has set up a catalogue of works of Horton Forest in an attempt to document all of his paintings. Horton Forest was born in 1826 in France. His education may have been intended to prepare him for a career in the British Army. In the 1830s, he was sent to Manning School, Jamaica, for his early education. About 1835, he had his portrait painted by Princess Dubrovsky, who was staying with the family. It's likely that his first lessons in painting were given by the princess when he was only 9 years old. Horton began his career as a maritime and landscape painter from a young age in Germany. Horton's family travelled extensively in France and Germany, where in 1840 he was enrolled at a German military school. It's believed that his father discouraged him from entering the German army. On leaving school, Horton remained in Germany until 1845, where he painted German castles downstream along the Rhine. He then joined the General Post Office in London, as several of his brothers had done. Horton appears to have spent the years between 1845 and 1853 in London, during which time he further developed his skills as a painter. On the 30th of September 1858, Horton married Susan Henrietta Somerville at Plymouth in Devon. Their early life was spent at Sandown on the Isle of Wight, also the Isle of Man and then Cumberland. While staying in the Strand, Horton applied to the Tasmanian Board of Immigration through their London agent. He ultimately secured a grant of land. On the 16th of May 1876, Horton, Susan and their 5 children embarked from London on the Macduff, arriving at Port Phillip Bay, then sailing on to Launceston on the SS Derwent. This was just 3 years before Beattie arrived in Tasmania. The Lands and Survey Department map of Derby Town Reserve shows the location of the grant of 100 acres to Horton Forest, which was selected on the west bank of the Ringarooma River. Horton was elected Superintendent of Police at Sorell, and he was appointed Bailiff of Crown Lands for the municipality of Sorell. He held this and other statutory positions until 1880. In 1881 he purchased a church rectory, Bay View, at O'Brien's Bridge on Humphreys Rivulet, Glenorchy. He sold this home to his eldest son, Lowther, in 1884. Several of his grandchildren were born at Bay View. On the 16th of May 1885 he paid £550 to purchase Heathville at No. 3 Apsley Street, South Hobart. The Tasmanian community knew him for his prolific output of paintings which were in demand. His friend John Watt Beattie, a photographer and bushwalker, interested Horton in painting scenes of the Tasmanian wilderness, which were then almost inaccessible to the majority of the population. Horton's wife Susan died in 1893 and was buried at the Queenborough Cemetery in Sandy Bay. In 1914 Horton was still painting and residing at 71 Davy Street. He painted well into the 1920s. On the 20th of January 1925, while staying with his daughter at Melton Mowbray, Horton passed away, aged 99. He was buried in the Queenborough Cemetery with a tall monument to mark the grave he shared with his wife. In 1963, the Hobart City Council authorised the removal of all the remains at the Queenborough Cemetery, with the intention of reinterring those in a mass grave at Cornelian Bay. It was not supervised, and as a result, gravestones were lost, smashed and dumped in a pile at the Cornelian Bay Cemetery. Press accounts of Horton Forrest frequently describe his demeanour as that of a true gentleman of Tasmania. He was looked up to for this reason. His press reviews on several occasions referred to him as a talented and much welcome newcomer to settle in the colony. I know several of the Beattie Studio audience have Forrest paintings hanging in their homes. The Forrest Project maintains a database of these paintings, and they track them and their ownership all around the world. They're also a nice group of people, and they contributed material for this episode. Lady Jane Franklin would really be pleased that her 1842 vision for a temple of the arts has really, come to fruition, and the Art Society of today is as vibrant and amazing as ever. In 2016, for example, they had 60 events and 13 full-on exhibitions. That's a massive effort. I'm really looking forward to this lockdown finishing so we can get out and enjoy that for ourselves. Thank you for watching. Cheers.